The hush that fell over La Satori was absolute. Forks hung mid-air. The pianist froze, his fingers suspended above the keys. All eyes turned toward the corner booth, where a frail Japanese man sat, his water glass shattered across the white linen. Moments earlier, no one had moved to help him. The staff had whispered he'd sent back 2 dishes already, complained about the temperature, demanded silence. Rumor said he was some kind of billionaire, and that alone made everyone nervous. The manager hovered nearby, waiting for an apology that never came. Then the new waitress stepped forward. Clara Hayes, in her plain black uniform, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and approached. Her co-workers tried to signal her to stop, but she didn't. She bent low, palms pressed together, and spoke softly. "Sumimasen desu, daihobu desu ka?" The words landed like a spark in dry air. The old man's head snapped up. Surprise broke across his weathered face, then relief. His reply came trembling. "Anata wa Nihongo o hanaseru no ka?" Clara smiled, her voice calm but clear. "I studied in Kyoto. They taught me that respect doesn't need translation." The billionaire's eyes glistened. For a heartbeat, the restaurant forgot who he was. All they saw was an old man meeting kindness in a foreign tongue. Across the room, a younger man in a navy suit, his assistant, though no one knew yet, watched the exchange closely. He lowered his phone, the screen still glowing with a half-written email. Whatever this waitress had just done, it had changed something in his employer's expression. At the front desk, the manager's jaw clenched. He could feel the hierarchy shifting beneath him. A simple act of empathy had silenced an entire room of power. Clara didn't notice the tension. She knelt to gather the broken glass, her movements slow, careful, precise. The old man murmured something in Japanese, soft, reverent. She answered him fluently, and the two shared a quiet laugh that melted the stiffness in the air. When she finally stood, the pianist resumed his song. Conversations restarted in low whispers, but the young man in the corner didn't look away. He was already making a note to find out who this waitress was and how she'd learned to speak his father's language so perfectly. Outside, the city lights glowed against the glass walls of La Satori, their reflections trembling like ripples in water. Inside, one small voice had just rewritten the night. The restaurant slowly exhaled, as though the entire room had been holding its breath since Clara spoke. The pianist recovered his rhythm. Waiters resumed their quiet choreography, and the soft hum of wealth returned to the air, but something invisible had changed. Clara felt it like a current beneath her skin, that strange awareness that she had stepped across an invisible line dividing those who serve from those who are served. She tried to slip back into routine, clearing plates and resetting glasses, but she could still feel the weight of the old man's gaze following her every movement. From the corner, his assistant continued to observe her with professional detachment, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. The name Takeda Hiroshi was whispered through the staff like a secret passed along in disbelief, the founder of Takeda Holdings, a man whose empire stretched from Tokyo to New York. Most of them had only seen his photo in business magazines, a symbol of ruthless precision and unshakable discipline. Yet here he was, fragile and kind-eyed, thanking a waitress for her manners in his native tongue. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Respect had arrived not from wealth, but from empathy. Clara retreated to the service station, her hands trembling as she refolded a napkin she had already folded twice. "What were you thinking?" hissed her manager, his voice low but sharp. "You don't speak to VIPs unless spoken to." His words carried the brittle edge of fear. She could tell he was terrified of losing control of the evening. "He dropped his glass," she said quietly. "I was just trying to help." The manager opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the assistant approached with an expression that silenced them both. "Mr. Takeda would like to speak with her," the man said evenly, his accent smooth but unmistakably Japanese. The manager's color drained. "Of course, sir. I'll escort—" "No need," the assistant interrupted, nodding at Clara. "He asked for her alone." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Clara's throat tightened, but she nodded and followed the man back to the table where the old billionaire waited, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Please, sit, Takeda said in English, his tone polite but firm. It is rare to hear my language spoken so naturally outside Japan. Clara hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate, but his eyes were gentle, almost fatherly. I lived in Kyoto for a year, she explained softly. I studied at Kansai University before I had to come home. The billionaire's gaze lingered on her face, then drifted to the delicate way she held her hands, as though each movement carried intention. And now you work here, he said, not as a question, but as an observation. She nodded once, the truth sitting heavily between them. You bowed the right way, he said after a pause. Not like the ones who pretend. My wife used to say, you can tell a person's soul by how they bow. His words carried a quiet grief, and Clara realized there was more beneath his composed exterior than anyone in that room had seen. Your wife sounds wise, she said gently. He smiled faintly. She was. She passed 5 years ago, but I still find myself waiting for her to correct me. Oh, the moment stretched, fragile but warm, and then the assistant cleared his throat, placing a sleek tablet on the table. Sir, the investors in Tokyo are waiting for your confirmation, he said. Takeda's face hardened, the softness retreating behind layers of control. He tapped the screen once, then looked up. Tell them to wait. I'm having a more important conversation. The assistant blinked, then bowed slightly and stepped aside. Across the room, the manager fidgeted nervously, pretending to check his watch while the other staff exchanged glances. The billionaire's attention had shifted fully to the waitress, and that alone was enough to send ripples through every hierarchy in the room. You remind me of someone, Takeda said finally. My daughter, perhaps. She lives in California, too busy to call her father. He chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with loneliness. Clara smiled, unsure how to respond, so she said the only thing that felt true. I'm sure she's proud of you, sir. He studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring the honesty in her words, then nodded. Perhaps, he said. But tonight, I am proud of you. Clara's eyes widened slightly. Me? He gestured to the empty glass beside him. No one in this room moved to help an old man. Only you did, and not for recognition, but for respect. That is something money cannot buy. The compliment felt surreal. It came from a man whose signature could move entire markets, yet he spoke to her as an equal. When she stood to leave, he raised a hand. One more thing, he said quietly. Would you write your name for me? She hesitated but nodded, taking his pen and writing on the corner of a napkin, Clara Hayes. Takeda folded the napkin carefully, as if it were made of silk. Arigato, Clara-san, he said, his tone solemn. You will hear from me again. I do place. As she walked back toward the kitchen, the air seemed thicker, filled with unspoken questions. The assistant watched her, expression unreadable, his phone already in hand as he typed something quickly. The manager rushed to her side, whispering harshly, What did he say? Are we in trouble? Clara shook her head, half smiling. I think, she murmured, he just thanked me. Behind her, the old billionaire sat in silence, turning the folded napkin between his fingers like a token of fate. Outside, the rain began to fall against the tall windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. Inside Le Satori, power had shifted quietly so gently that no one noticed, except the man who had built an empire and the woman who had just reminded him what humanity sounded like in perfect Japanese. The rain did not stop that night. It drummed softly on the restaurant's wide windows as the last customers left, and the street outside blurred into streaks of silver. Clara stood by the counter, stacking menus, trying to quiet the rush of thoughts in her mind. The napkin with her name on it was gone, folded neatly into the billionaire's pocket like a secret she hadn't meant to give away. The manager had already retreated to his office, pretending the evening had ended smoothly, though his face had carried a pale, anxious gleam. The staff whispered in corners, wondering why the powerful Japanese guest had lingered so long with a waitress who spoke his language like a native. None of them knew that she herself didn't fully understand what she had awakened. The next morning, Le Satori opened to its usual routine, The hiss of espresso machines, the scent of polished wood, the quiet symphony of silverware. Yet beneath the calm, tension pulsed. The manager was unusually stiff, snapping at servers, checking the front door every few minutes. When two black sedans pulled up to the curb just before noon, conversation dropped to a hush. A group of men in dark suits entered first, followed by the same assistant from the night before. Behind him walked Takeda Hiroshi, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding, like gravity itself had followed him into the room. Clara froze halfway through polishing a wine glass, unsure whether to bow or hide. The assistant approached her station with a polite nod. "Miss Hayes," he said, his tone formal, "Mr. Takeda would like to see you." The other staff exchanged uneasy glances. The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Takeda's voice cut through the space before he could speak. "It's all right," the old man said evenly. "I only wish to thank her." The authority in his tone silenced everyone. Clara followed him to a quiet table by the window, feeling every pair of eyes on her back. Takeda sat slowly, resting his hands on the table, and for a long moment he simply studied her face. Then he reached into his coat and placed the folded napkin in front of her. "You wrote your name," he said, "but I wanted to know your story." He opened a sleek tablet, showing a document already pulled up a scholarship record from Kansai University. Her photo from years ago, smiling in a student uniform. Clara's breath caught. "How did you?" she began. But he lifted a hand. "I fund that program," he said softly. "Every student who leaves without graduating becomes a question I try to answer. You were one of them." Her throat tightened as old memories surged back. The sudden illness of her mother, the unpaid tuition, the flight home she couldn't afford but took anyway. "I didn't mean to waste your investment," she whispered. "I just couldn't stay." Takeda's expression softened. "You didn't waste it," he said. "You honored it last night." He paused, letting the words settle. "When no one else remembered our culture, you did. You reminded me of something my company lost long ago, grace." The assistant stepped forward and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a single card embossed with the Takeda crest. "This is a contact from our New York division," the old man continued. "They need an interpreter, someone who understands both languages and both kinds of people." Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Me? But I'm just a waitress." Takeda smiled gently, the corners of his eyes folding like paper fans. "Last night, that was enough to teach an entire room a lesson. I believe you can teach more." The offer hung between them like a fragile bridge. Around them, the restaurant remained silent, as though reality itself had stepped back to watch. Clara thought of her mother, of the endless bills, of the nights she'd studied Japanese phrases under a flickering kitchen light. She thought of the way no one had moved to help the man who had once seemed unreachable, and how a simple bow had changed the course of the evening. When she finally found her voice, it trembled with disbelief. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Takeda replied. "Just promise me you'll keep speaking in the language of respect." Then he rose, and for the second time bowed to her deeply, deliberately, with the weight of a man who understood what humility cost. Gasps rippled through the staff as the billionaire straightened and turned toward the exit. The assistant followed, leaving a single business card on the table, its gold lettering catching the light. When they were gone, Clara sat in stunned silence. The manager approached cautiously, his voice cracking. "What was that about?" he asked, his tone half resentful, half fearful. She stared at the card, the Takeda emblem gleaming like a tiny sundae. "I think," she said slowly, "it was a job offer." The words felt unreal, yet their truth settled into her bones with quiet certainty. Outside, the sedans merged into the pulse of Manhattan traffic, leaving behind a restaurant still vibrating from what it had witnessed. The rumor would spread quickly how a billionaire bowed to a waitress, how a forgotten language bridged the distance between two worlds. By closing time, even the manager would tell the story differently, emphasizing that he had encouraged her bravery. But Clara knew the truth belonged to no one but her, and the man who had seen her not as a servant, but as a mirror. That night, as she walked home beneath the drizzle, the neon lights painted the sidewalks in ribbons of gold and violet. She replayed the moment of his bow, the silent awe of the room, the sudden realization that kindness had rewritten hierarchy. At a crosswalk, she looked up at the skyscrapers that cut through the clouds and whispered softly, in Japanese, Kei wa sekai no kotoba. Respect is the world's language. The city hummed around her, indifferent yet alive, and for the first time in years, Clara felt lighter than the rain. Somewhere above the noise, a quiet melody played from a rooftop piano, echoing the same tune that had paused in La Satori the night before. This time, it didn't freeze, it flowed, steady and sure, like a promise continuing to unfold. The following week unfolded like a dream Clara was afraid to wake from, each morning layered with disbelief that something so small had changed so much. The card Takeda had left rested on her bedside table, its embossed crest gleaming faintly in the early light, as if reminding her that her life now had two directions, the world she knew and the one quietly waiting to begin. Every morning before her shift, she stared at the number printed in elegant gold and rehearsed what she might say if she ever dared to call. She imagined herself fluent and composed, not a waitress in worn shoes, but a woman who could translate between nations, the way she once had between loneliness and grace. At La Satori, things no longer felt the same. The staff, once dismissive, now watched her with a new mix of curiosity and caution. The manager's tone had softened, his voice adopting the brittle politeness reserved for people who might outrank him someday. Even regular customers seemed to glance at her twice, whispering the now famous story of the waitress who made the billionaire bow. Clara worked as always, steady, quiet, deliberate. But beneath her calm, she carried a private trembling, the sense that the world had shifted beneath her feet, yet expected her to act as if it hadn't. 3 days later, the assistant returned. He entered with the same quiet precision, dressed in an immaculate navy suit, his presence commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. The staff froze, trays midair, conversations dissolving into silence. He approached the counter where Clara stood polishing silverware, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Miss Hayes," he said, his English careful and crisp, "Mr. Takeda would like to invite you to dinner this evening. There is something he wishes to discuss in person." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples she could not yet name. That evening, Clara found herself standing outside a penthouse overlooking the East River, where the skyline shimmered in gold and violet reflection. The door opened to reveal Takeda's assistant, who bowed slightly before guiding her through a corridor lined with photographs, Tokyo streets, Kyoto temples, and a portrait of a young woman who could have been Clara's age, smiling in sunlight. "His daughter," the assistant said quietly, following her gaze. "She passed away 2 years ago." Clara's breath caught. Suddenly, the old man's loneliness the night of their first meeting made sense. Takeda waited in a minimalist dining room where a single bonsai tree stood near the window. He looked smaller than she remembered, yet his eyes still carried the same lucid warmth. "Clara-san," he greeted, his Japanese pronunciation deliberate. "Please, sit." She obeyed, unsure whether to bow or simply nod. "I hope you forgive my insistence," he continued, "but I believe our meeting was not coincidence. When I left Japan, I told myself I would no longer look for meaning in chance. Yet here you are." His voice was calm but threaded with something almost fragile, a confession hidden inside formality. Dinner unfolded in delicate silence, each course arriving like an art form. Miso soup, sushi arranged in perfect symmetry, matcha served in hand-painted bowls. Takeda ate little, his gaze distant, while Clara found herself speaking more freely than she expected. She told him about her mother's illness, about working double shifts, about the scholarship she'd lost and the dreams she'd folded away for practicality. The old man listened without interruption, his expression shifting only once, when she mentioned that she still practiced Japanese alone at night to keep from forgetting who she was before the world taught her limits. "You have not forgotten," he said softly. "You only paused." When dessert arrived, green tea ice cream melting into porcelain stillness. Takeda set down his spoon and leaned back. "My daughter Aiko," he said, his eyes focused on the bonsai tree, "loved language. She believed words were bridges. After she died, I could no longer cross them." He turned to her then, his voice gaining quiet strength. "But when you spoke to me in that restaurant, you built a bridge without knowing it. You reminded me that communication is not about understanding every word, it is about choosing to see another human being." Clara felt her throat tighten, unsure whether to speak. "Sir," she began, "I only did what anyone should have done." He shook his head gently. "No, everyone else chose fear. You chose compassion. That difference builds empires or destroys them." He reached into a drawer beside him and drew out a folder, sliding it across the table. "This," he said, "is a contract for a 6-month position with our Cultural Exchange Initiative. Translation, interpretation, and international training. It is not glamorous, but it matters." She stared at the folder, the black ink crisp against white paper. Her name typed neatly on the first page. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she whispered. "Qualification is not the same as worth," Takeda said, his tone as steady as the river beyond the glass. "You proved your worth the moment you saw me as a person, not a title." The simplicity of the statement pierced her in a way grand speeches never could. Later, as the meeting drew to a close, Takeda walked her to the door himself. The assistant waited discreetly near the elevator, pretending not to notice the tremor in Clara's hands as she clutched the folder. "One more thing," the billionaire said before she stepped inside. "When you bow, remember that it is not an act of submission. It is a recognition of connection. The world needs more people who understand that." His words hung in the air, soft but commanding, like incense smoke fading toward the ceiling. That night, Clara rode the elevator down 40 floors in silence, the city glittering below her like a promise she hadn't dared to claim. She stepped into the cool air, the noise of traffic rising like a heartbeat, and looked up at the tower's mirrored facade. Somewhere above, a man who had once been untouchable had offered her a future written not in wealth but in respect. The folder felt warm against her chest, a bridge she had been building her whole life without realizing it. As she walked toward the subway, the city lights shimmered across puddles left by the afternoon rain. For the first time, she didn't feel small in their reflection. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fatigue and uncertainty, something steady had begun to grow, a quiet understanding that she had already crossed the bridge Takeda spoke of, and on the other side waited not privilege, but purpose. A week after the dinner, the offer still sat unopened on Clara's kitchen table, its white envelope bright against the dull laminate surface of her small Queens apartment. Each morning she'd make coffee, glance at it, and tell herself she would decide tomorrow. It wasn't fear of failure that kept her frozen. It was the weight of what the decision meant. Accepting it would mean stepping into a life she had long ago buried, a life of ambition and exposure, a life that required her to stand tall instead of hiding behind trays and polite smiles. For years, she had survived by being invisible. Now, she was being asked to be seen. Outside, the city moved without pause. The trains screeched, the vendors shouted, and the wind carried the smell of roasted chestnuts down the block. It was early November, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around her and started her walk to Lisatori. The world seemed ordinary again, yet beneath that ordinariness, she could feel something trembling, an anticipation she couldn't name. When she arrived, the manager was waiting near the host stand, his nervous energy almost comical. "Clara," he whispered, leaning close, "we just got a call. There's going to be a visit from someone important. Corporate level important." She blinked. "Who?" He swallowed. "Takeda Holdings. Their American director. He's flying in from San Francisco." Her pulse stuttered. The name was familiar enough to send a chill down her spine. The old man's promise, "You will hear from me again," echoed somewhere deep in her memory. "When?" she asked. "Today," he said. "He's on his way now." The restaurant erupted into quiet chaos. Staff scrambling to polish, chefs shouting orders, candles lit, glasses buffed until they gleamed. The pianist tuned his instrument twice. But Clara felt none of the usual panic. Instead, she felt a strange calm, as though she already knew how this would unfold. By the time the car arrived, the sky had dimmed into bruised blue. The doors opened, and a man in his mid-30s stepped out, sharp suit, controlled movements, eyes as unreadable as still water. It was Takeda's assistant, though now his presence carried the authority of command. He entered with 2 associates and a translator who, Clara quickly noticed, wasn't quite fluent. Every sentence the translator delivered came out clipped, hesitant, and the rhythm of the conversation between him and the staff faltered. The assistant's expression tightened, his patience fraying. Clara stood by the bar, heart pounding, watching the scene teeter toward embarrassment. When the manager gestured for her to fetch water, she hesitated, unsure whether to interfere. Then, almost without thinking, she stepped forward. "May I help, sir?" she asked softly, switching to Japanese before he could answer. The assistant turned sharply, recognition flickering in his gaze. The translator fell silent. Clara continued, her words careful but fluid, bridging the pause with effortless grace. Whatever tension had lingered dissolved instantly. The associates relaxed, the staff resumed their rhythm, and the assistant's shoulders eased, as though an invisible burden had been lifted. Afterward, he approached her, his tone formal but edged with something warmer. "You speak as if you've lived there your whole life," he said. "Just 1 year," she replied, "but it changed everything." He nodded, then handed her an envelope, this one black with gold lettering. "From Mr. Takeda," he said. "He asked that I deliver it personally." She took it, the paper smooth beneath her trembling fingers. "What is it?" she asked. "A message," he said, "and perhaps a test." When she opened it later in the staff lounge, she found a single handwritten line, "When truth stands alone, respect must speak for it." Beneath the sentence was a note in English. "Be at the Takeda Holdings conference tomorrow at 9. Bring nothing but honesty." The next morning she arrived at the towering glass building that overlooked Bryant Park, her reflection stretched thin across the mirrored facade. Security escorted her upstairs to a boardroom lined with executives in tailored suits, the kind of room where silence was sharper than any blade. At the head of the table sat a man. She hadn't expected a stern-faced figure introduced as Mr. Blank. Caldwell, the American director, and beside him, the assistant from La Satori, now clearly in a higher position than before. The conversation began formally, a discussion about cross-cultural partnerships, about language programs, about human connection in corporate diplomacy. Then Caldwell turned his cold eyes toward Clara. "Miss Hayes," he said, his tone heavy with skepticism, "you've become somewhat of a story, the girl who made a billionaire bow. Do you understand how absurd that sounds?" The question sliced through the air, condescending, deliberate. Clara inhaled slowly, the same calm she'd carried in that restaurant settling over her again. "It's not absurd," she said quietly. "It's human." The room stilled. Caldwell leaned forward, his lips curling slightly. "And what does that mean?" he asked. She met his gaze evenly. "It means respect doesn't rise with status, it begins with it. That's what Mr. Takeda taught me." A flicker of movement crossed the assistant's face, a small, approving smile. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, dismissive but unsettled. "You think that kind of sentiment builds companies?" he said. "It built his," she replied, her voice steady. "And maybe it can rebuild ours." The silence that followed was electric. Then Takeda's voice broke through the conference speaker system, calm and commanding. "She is correct," he said in Japanese, his words translated almost simultaneously through the intercom. "Empires built without respect collapse in silence. I have chosen her to represent us because she understands what most of you have forgotten." The room shifted. Caldwell's arrogance faltered, replaced by confusion, then quiet resignation. The assistant bowed slightly toward Clara. "Welcome to Takeda Holdings," he said softly. "Your position begins today." Oh, outside the city's hum seemed different, brighter, as she stepped back into the November air. The sky stretched pale and clear above the skyscrapers, and for the first time, she didn't feel small among them. She had walked into a room of power and spoken not with wealth or titles, but with truth, and somehow that had been enough. In her pocket, the first envelope creased, worn. White reminded her of the moment it had all begun, a bow, a language, a voice that refused to stay silent. As she crossed Bryant Park, the cold wind tugging at her hair, Clara smiled to herself and whispered the words again, the ones she had written in her heart since that night at Lassatori. Respect speaks every language, and this time the city seemed to answer back. The next morning dawned pale and crystalline, the kind of New York winter light that made the city look both raw and eternal. Clara stood before the glass facade of Takeda Holdings, her reflection framed by steel and sky, her breath fogging faintly against the cold. Inside her coat pocket was her new ID badge, simple, rectangular, gleaming with the company's crest. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it symbolized: responsibility, trust, and a fragile bridge between worlds. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking into a restaurant to serve others. She was walking into a boardroom to be heard. The lobby was a cathedral of silence and efficiency, all marble floors and golden light. Every click of her heels echoed through the space like punctuation marks in a language she was still learning to speak. Employees glanced up as she passed, their eyes curious but cautious, already whispering about the waitress who spoke Japanese. She smiled politely, pretending not to notice, but beneath her composure she felt the familiar pulse of anxiety, the fear that this new life might vanish as suddenly as it appeared. Still, she straightened her posture and pressed forward. Her first assignment was to assist the Cultural Relations Division, a sleek floor of glass offices and muted tones overlooking the river. There she met her supervisor, a quiet, meticulous woman named Mina, whose kindness carried the same precision as her speech. "You were chosen because you understand nuance," Mina said on their first day together. "Language is not only words, it is how you hold silence." The phrase lingered with Clara long after the meeting ended, echoing in the rhythm of her thoughts. She realized that in this world, power spoke softly but listened loudly, and survival depended on knowing when to do both. For the next few weeks, Clara immersed herself in the work translating correspondence, reviewing partnership proposals, assisting during international meetings where every pause carried political weight. She found herself thriving under pressure, her linguistic instincts sharp, her empathy bridging cultural divides the way no manual could teach. Yet even as her confidence grew, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being observed. Small things caught her attention. An unfamiliar name copied on her reports, subtle glances exchanged between executives, a lingering question from Mina. "Have you spoken to Mr. Caldwell since the conference?" That seemed loaded with more than curiosity. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal for a Japanese-American mentorship initiative, Clara discovered a clause buried deep within the document, one that would quietly strip the Japanese branch of decision-making power and consolidate authority under the U.S. division. The language was elegant but deceptive, masked beneath layers of business jargon. She reread it twice, her pulse quickening. This wasn't collaboration, it was colonization. She traced the signature at the bottom and froze. It was Caldwell's. For several minutes, she sat motionless, the weight of realization pressing against her ribs. The man who had belittled her at the meeting was now maneuvering to dismantle everything Takeda stood for, using her translations as the paper bridge for betrayal. Her first instinct was fear. Fear of losing her job, of being labeled disloyal, of becoming invisible again. But beneath the fear came anger, slow and clean, the kind of anger that didn't burn but clarified. She thought of Takeda's words. Empires built without respect collapse in silence. She could not remain silent now. That night, she stayed late in the empty office, her computer screen casting a soft blue light over her face. She began cross-referencing files, comparing memos, connecting patterns. What she found confirmed her suspicion. Caldwell had been transferring control of key cultural programs under false pretenses, disguising exploitation as efficiency. The betrayal stretched further than she'd imagined, and yet exposing him would mean challenging a man far more powerful than she had ever been allowed to confront. At midnight, she closed her laptop and stood by the window. The city shimmered below like a living map of choices and consequences. In her reflection, she saw both versions of herself, the timid waitress who bowed, and the woman who now carried truth like a fragile flame. For a long time, she simply stared at her own eyes until the reflection steadied into resolve. She would not let deceit win beneath the banner of respect. The next morning, she went directly to Mina. The older woman listened in silence as Clara laid out her findings, her voice trembling only once. When she finished, Mina exhaled slowly, her face unreadable. "You understand what you're risking," she said. Clara nodded. "If I stay quiet, I betray the same respect Mr. Takeda taught me." Mina studied her for a long moment, then rose from her chair. "Prepare your evidence," she said. "We will present it to him directly." By afternoon, Clara stood once more in the penthouse conference room overlooking the river. The same skyline that had once intimidated her now seemed almost fragile, its towers gleaming like glass promises. Takeda sat at the head of the table, calm and watchful, while Caldwell leaned back in his chair, exuding practiced confidence. Mina placed the folder in front of the old man and stepped aside. "Miss Hayes has something to show you," she said quietly. Clara's hands didn't tremble as she opened the file and began to speak. Each word fell into the silence like a measured drop of rain, clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She translated sections, pointed out discrepancies, and finally read the clause aloud in Japanese, letting its meaning hang in the air. Takeda's expression darkened, his composure cracking just enough for disappointment to show. Caldwell's smirk faded into stiffness, his eyes darting toward the assistant seated nearby. When she finished, Takeda folded his hands, his voice calm but heavy. "Is this true?" he asked, looking directly at Caldwell. The man stammered, offered half explanations, then silence. The old billionaire rose slowly, every movement deliberate. "You speak of efficiency," he said, his English measured. "But efficiency without integrity is only theft performed politely." The room went still. Takeda turned toward Clara, his expression softening. "You have honored the language of respect once again," he said, "and reminded me why I still believe in it." When the meeting ended, the assistant escorted Caldwell out in silence. Mina touched Clara's shoulder gently, pride glinting behind her composure. "That was brave," she said. Clara smiled faintly. "It wasn't bravery," she replied. "It was translation." That night, walking home beneath a quiet snowfall, Clara felt something deep inside settle into peace. She understood now that her gift had never been language alone. It was the courage to speak when silence was safer. Above her, the city lights flickered through the falling snow, each one a small translation of the same truth. Respect, spoken clearly, could still rewrite the world. The snow had not stopped for 2 days, layering the city in a soft, fragile silence that felt both cleansing and deceptive. From her office window, Clara watched the flakes drift past the glass, blurring the skyline into watercolor shades of silver and blue. The storm outside mirrored the calm before another storm she sensed building within Takeda Holdings, a quiet tension that hummed beneath the polished decor and polite greetings. Since the meeting where Caldwell had been exposed, whispers had filled the corridors, some reverent, others skeptical. To some, she was a hero. To others, a reminder that truth could still pierce power. Her days became a blur of tasks, reports, and new responsibilities she had never asked for. Mina entrusted her with leading small cross-cultural workshops, training executives in the subtleties of communication that couldn't be found in textbooks. Each session left Clara drained but fulfilled, as if she were translating more than words, she was translating humanity. Yet even as she worked, she could feel eyes watching her, curious, calculating, waiting. The removal of Caldwell had not erased ambition from the building. It had only shifted its shape. Power, she realized, was never destroyed. It simply found new rooms to inhabit. One evening, long after most of the staff had left, Clara stayed to review a series of letters Takeda had received from Japan. They were written in an older dialect, elegant and formal, and the handwriting itself carried authority. She translated them carefully, line by line, until one phrase stopped her cold. It spoke of a division dispute, of someone within the American branch undermining Takeda's plans to donate a major share of profits to cultural preservation efforts in Kyoto. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. The betrayal hadn't ended with Caldwell. Someone else was still pulling strings. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was an old document, or perhaps a misunderstanding in translation. But the dates proved recent, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was Mina's. For several minutes, Clara sat frozen, staring at the delicate brushstrokes of the signature, unable to reconcile the revelation with the woman who had guided her, protected her, believed in her. The warmth of the office felt suddenly oppressive, the light too harsh. She remembered Takeda's words. Empires built without respect collapse in silence, and felt a cold certainty forming in her chest. The next morning, Mina entered the office as if nothing had changed, offering her usual calm smile. "Long night?" she asked, noticing the dark circles beneath Clara's eyes. Clara nodded but said nothing, her mind a storm of conflict. She wanted to confront her immediately, to demand an explanation, but something held her back. She needed to understand first, to know whether Mina's actions were betrayal or survival. For 2 days, she watched quietly, listening, tracing documents, reading every memo Mina signed. What she discovered was more complex than she imagined. Mina hadn't stolen or profited. She had rerouted part of the Kyoto fund to cover severance payments for hundreds of Japanese workers laid off in a subsidiary's quiet downsizing. The executives had ordered silence. She had defied them. Her signature on those letters wasn't corruption, it was rebellion. Yet the rebellion, if exposed, would destroy her career and unravel the delicate trust between Takeda's global branches. Clara realized she stood at another impossible intersection of ethics and loyalty. Protect the woman who had protected her, or expose the truth, as she always had. That night, she went to see Takeda at his penthouse, the snow still whispering against the windows. He welcomed her with the same paternal kindness as always, but there was fatigue in his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. "You've been quiet," he said. "Quiet can mean peace, or it can mean a storm is gathering." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes silence is both," she said softly. Then she handed him the translated letters. He read in silence, his expression unmoving, though his eyes flickered at Mina's signature. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at Clara for a long time. "You were right to bring this," he said, "but you must understand every act of compassion comes with consequence." He stood and walked to the window, the city's reflection glinting off his glasses. "Mina has been my conscience for years. She sees where I am blind. Perhaps she has chosen to bear guilt so that others may keep their honor." His tone was neither angry nor disappointed, just weary. "What would you do if you were in her place?" The question cut deeper than she expected. She thought of her mother, of nights spent calculating which bills could be paid and which could wait. She thought of the faces of workers whose livelihoods hung on decisions made in rooms like this. "I think," she said finally, "I would have done the same." Takeda nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. "Then you understand," he said. "Truth is not always justice, and justice is not always gentle." When Clara returned to the office the next morning, Mina was waiting by her desk, eyes sharp with quiet knowledge. "He knows," Mina said simply. "You told him." Clara's breath caught, but Mina only sighed, her shoulders lowering. "It's all right. I was tired of carrying it alone." They stood in silence for a moment before Mina reached into her bag and handed Clara a small envelope. "You'll need this more than I do," she said. Inside was a recommendation letter addressed to Takeda's executive board, nominating Clara as interim director for the cultural program. "You're resigning?" Clara asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Mina smiled faintly. "No one resigns from truth, Clara. We just pass it on." She gathered her coat and walked out, her steps slow but sure, leaving behind an office that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. That evening, as the sun melted behind the skyline, Clara stood at the same window where she had once watched snowfall and promises form. Below her, the river reflected the city lights like ripples of memory, endless and alive. She realized that the role she had inherited wasn't about language or diplomacy, it was about the courage to speak when silence demanded obedience, and to listen when truth came softly disguised as betrayal. The world beyond the glass seemed to blur and steady at once. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang over the city, marking another hour in a place that never stopped moving. Clara turned away from the window, the reflection of her own face merging with the lights behind her. She was no longer the invisible waitress or the student who had left Kyoto too soon. She had become something else entirely, a bridge that others could cross, even when the path was uncertain. As she left the office that night, the snow began to fall again, quiet as forgiveness, endless as translation. Weeks passed, and winter deepened its hold over Manhattan, pressing the skyline under a pale gray sky that seemed to mute both noise and color. The snow along the curbs had turned to ice, reflecting the streetlights like scattered glass, and inside the Takeda building, the air carried a new kind of tension, polite, watchful, almost reverent. With Mina gone, Clara's presence had become both symbol and anomaly. The woman who spoke truth in the language of power, yet still smiled like someone who didn't belong among those marble floors. She could feel the invisible eyes following her down corridors, admiration blending with doubt, curiosity mixing with envy. Every meeting, every translated phrase now carried the weight of perception, and she understood that in this world, reputation was its own currency. Her new role demanded constant poise. Each morning, she reviewed international correspondence, prepared speeches for Takeda's upcoming philanthropy summit, and coordinated initiatives linking American and Japanese cultural institutions. The work filled her days completely, leaving little room for reflection. But sometimes, in quiet moments between calls, she caught herself missing the simplicity of l'ossatori, the warmth of clinking glasses, the hum of conversation, the soft rhythm of ordinary life. Here, the stakes were different. Every word she chose had the power to shift alliances or bruise egos. Still, she approached it the same way she had once approached a dinner table. Steady hands, open heart, perfect balance between humility and precision. One afternoon, while finalizing the draft for Takeda's keynote address, she received a message marked urgent. The sender's name made her pause. It was from Ethan Caldwell, the very man she had helped unmask. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The message was brief. "You think you saved him, but you only delayed the inevitable. Meet me, Midtown, tonight." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she read it again. There was no return number, only an address, a private gallery near Bryant Park. She knew logic demanded she ignore it, yet something deeper urged her forward. Truth, she had learned, rarely stayed buried. By dusk, she found herself standing in front of the gallery's frosted glass door, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold. Inside, the lights glowed dimly over minimalist art displays and quiet music. Caldwell was already there, leaning against a marble pillar, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with restrained anger. "You really came," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "I didn't think you'd have the courage." She met his gaze evenly, refusing to flinch. "You sent for me," she said. "Say what you need to say." He stepped closer, his tone shifting from mockery to accusation. "You think Takeda's empire runs on honor. It runs on illusion. You just traded one lie for another." He handed her a folder, its edges smudged with fingerprints. Inside is proof that Takeda's donation projects aren't as pure as you believe. Money moves, Clara, and it never moves clean. She hesitated, glancing down at the folder but not touching it. "Why show me this?" she asked. Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because you're the only one naive enough to care. And when it collapses, you'll be the perfect scapegoat, the ideal moral face of a corrupt machine." His words sank into her chest like cold water. She wanted to dismiss them, but a small, uneasy part of her mind whispered that truth and corruption often shared the same room. "You expect me to believe you after everything you've done?" she said quietly. "Believe what you want," he replied, turning toward the exit. "But when the curtain falls, make sure you're not standing center stage." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing through the empty gallery. Clara stayed for a long moment, staring at the folder on the table. Part of her wanted to throw it away, to refuse the seed of doubt he had planted. But the other part, the part that had always chased clarity, even when it hurt, reached for it. She opened it slowly, scanning the first few pages, and what she saw made her stomach twist. The documents weren't forged. They detailed a series of shell donations routed through third-party firms, legitimate on paper, but siphoning funds to political campaigns and private accounts. The transactions were complex, disguised as cultural investments, but the evidence was clear enough to destroy reputations, maybe even Takeda himself. She spent the night at her desk, cross-referencing records, verifying signatures, following digital trails until dawn spilled pale gold across her keyboard. Everything matched. The scandal was real. But so was her doubt, because not all the signatures belonged to strangers. One, near the bottom of the latest report, was unmistakably Takeda's. Her heart cracked open with disbelief. The man who had bowed to her, who had taught her about respect and integrity, was either complicit or blind. She didn't know which truth would hurt more. When she finally looked up from the computer, her reflection stared back at her in the glass, pale, exhausted, resolute. She thought of Mina's quiet defiance, of Takeda's weary wisdom, of the line she had walked since the beginning between honesty and loyalty. There was no easy choice, only the same truth she had carried since Les Satori. Power bends people in ways they never expect, and kindness costs more than ambition ever admits. She stood, gathered the documents, and slipped them into a plain envelope. The next morning she requested a private meeting with Takeda. He received her in silence, his expression unreadable. "You've found something," he said before she could speak. She laid the folder on the table between them. "These records," she said softly, "they could destroy everything we've built." He studied her face for a long time, then exhaled. "So it has reached you," he murmured. "I wondered when it would." His words were calm, but the heaviness in them was unmistakable. "You knew?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "And I've been trying to undo it quietly before others turned it into a weapon." The revelation stunned her. Yet beneath the shock, she saw the truth in his weary eyes. "You can't fight corruption with silence," she said. "Silence is what let it grow." He nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it's time you spoke again," he said, his gaze steady. "Not as my interpreter, but as my conscience." When she left his office, the city outside was caught in a soft snowstorm, the flakes swirling like ash and light. She clutched the folder to her chest, feeling both the weight of betrayal and the clarity of purpose. Whatever came next, she would no longer speak for power. She would speak to it. And this time, she would make sure every word carried the full weight of truth, even if it broke the silence Takeda had tried so hard to protect. The following week felt like the pause between heartbeats, silent, stretched, trembling with the weight of choices yet to be made. Outside the Takeda headquarters, New York's winter had hardened into ice. Streets shimmered with frost, and every breath rose like smoke against the skyline. Inside, the building seemed to pulse with a quiet unease. Conversations hushed when Clara passed. Executives whispered in glass rooms, their reflections merging with the city beyond. Everyone knew something was shifting, though no one could name it. The truth she had uncovered sat between her and Takeda like a live wire, dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. Each morning she came to work before sunrise, the lobby still dim, the river glinting like silver through the high windows. She reviewed reports, corrected translations, and pretended that her hands didn't shake every time she opened an email. Beneath the surface of the ordinary, a storm was forming. Whispers from Tokyo hinted at investigations, journalists calling for transparency, and board members demanding answers. It was only a matter of time before the illusion shattered completely. And she, once a nameless waitress, stood at its center, holding the evidence that could burn everything to the ground or cleanse it. Takeda summoned her on a Tuesday morning, his voice over the intercom calm but heavy. "Come to my office," he said. "Bring the documents." She walked the familiar corridor, her heels clicking against marble, the sound echoing like a countdown. When she entered, he stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, the skyline reflecting in the glass like another world. "I've made my decision," he said without turning. "We will go public." Clara's breath caught. "You mean admit everything?" He turned, his expression steady but sorrowful. "Yes. If I hide, I confirm their accusations. If I speak, perhaps I save what still matters." He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. "You'll lose everything," she said quietly. "Maybe," he replied. "But respect, once lost, is far more costly than money." His words carried the same quiet dignity that had first drawn her to him, but she saw the exhaustion beneath it, the toll of carrying an empire built on both honor and illusion. He reached for a small box on his desk and opened it carefully. Inside lay a silver fountain pen, engraved with Japanese characters. "My wife gave this to me when we began Takeda Holdings," he said. "She told me that one day I would have to choose between legacy and truth. I believe that day has come." He extended the pen toward her. "You will help me write the statement." They worked together in silence for hours. Each sentence was weighed, measured, stripped of pretense, until only honesty remained. Clara translated his thoughts into English and Japanese, ensuring every word carried the same integrity in both languages. It was not a confession, it was an awakening. When they finished, the document read like a requiem for greed and a prayer for renewal. Takeda signed it with the silver pen, his hand trembling slightly. "Now," he said softly, "we see who still stands when the truth arrives." By evening, the news had spread. Financial networks, social media, and business outlets across 2 continents buzzed with disbelief. Takeda Holdings to self. Audit. CEO admits internal failings. Some called it suicide, others called it history. Reporters crowded the front of the building, flashes lighting the frozen air. Inside, chaos erupted: calls, denials, frantic legal maneuvers. Through it all, Takeda remained composed, his calm radiating like still water in a storm. Clara stayed by his side, translating his statements, her voice unwavering even as she felt the tremor of collapse ripple beneath her feet. That night, as the offices emptied and the last of the reporters drifted away, Takeda stood again at the window, watching snow fall over the river. "You've done more than I asked," he said quietly. "You gave me courage I had forgotten I still possessed." She shook her head. "You gave it to yourself. I only reminded you where to look." He smiled faintly, then turned serious. "Caldwell will use this," he said. "He still has allies in the board. They will come for me and for you." "I'm not afraid," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "I've already lived my life afraid. This is better." He nodded slowly, as though accepting a truth too simple to dispute. "Then whatever happens next," he said, "promise me you won't let them turn silence into safety again." She met his gaze and nodded. "I promise." And the next morning, the boardroom was full. Executives, lawyers, and shareholders crowded around the long mahogany table, their voices sharp, urgent, layered with blame. At the head sat Takeda, serene, and beside him, Clara, her notes spread neatly across the table. The accusations began immediately. Words like reckless, naive, disloyal filled the air like shards of glass. She translated every sentence calmly, refusing to soften the venom. When one board member sneered that Takeda's humility had made the company a laughingstock, she met his eyes and said, "A man who hides truth for profit has already lost what laughter can't buy." The room fell silent. After the meeting, Takeda dismissed the board and thanked her quietly. "You spoke well," he said. "Too well. They will not forgive you easily." She smiled faintly. "They don't have to." Outside, snow continued to fall, and sirens wailed faintly in the distance, the city pulsing with the indifferent rhythm of survival. That evening, Clara walked alone through Bryant Park, the news still glowing on screens above every street corner. Some hailed Takeda as a visionary, others called him a fool. She didn't care. The truth, she realized, was neither victory nor defeat. It was simply light, and light always hurt before it healed. She stood by the fountain, its surface frozen, and whispered the words she had carried from the beginning. Respect speaks every language. Behind her, the city hummed on, alive and unbroken, and she understood that whatever came next, praise, exile, redemption, she had already won something no empire could give. She had turned language into justice and silence into courage, and that, she thought, was more permanent than power itself. The city woke to headlines that seemed to hum through every subway tunnel and corner cafe, the kind of news that split people into believers and cynics. Takeda Holdings confession sparks global inquiry. Billionaire CEO admits fault, stock plummets overnight. Some saw courage, others weakness, but no one looked away. In offices and living rooms, people debated whether morality had a place in money, and in every conversation, Clara's name surfaced like an echo, the interpreter who forced the truth into daylight. She hadn't meant to become a symbol. She had only meant to be honest. Yet symbols, she was learning, are rarely given a choice. Within the company, the atmosphere felt strange, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to a new kind of gravity. Gone were the whispers of quiet ambition, replaced by the sound of uncertainty, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the sighs of men and women unsure which way to turn. Clara continued her work with quiet steadiness, translating not only languages but chaos into coherence. Every statement she drafted, every press reply she shaped, carried the tone Takeda had asked of her. Remorse without surrender, humility without collapse. It was a delicate balance, the art of falling gracefully. Takeda, meanwhile, had retreated into a rare stillness. The public confession had cost him not only fortune but favor, and though his reputation among ordinary people grew strangely radiant, the elite whispered that he had gone soft. Clara visited his office each day, bringing reports, but sometimes she found him gazing out at the skyline like a man watching something slip beyond his grasp. "Do you regret it?" she asked once, her voice low. He didn't turn. "Every day," he said, and not at all. The paradox sat between them like air too thin to breathe. Weeks turned into a kind of limbo. Investigations spread across continents, uncovering both malice and mercy in equal measure. Some executives resigned quietly, others were arrested. Through it all, Clara remained untouched, though not invisible. Journalists sought her for interviews. She always declined, insisting that the story wasn't hers to tell. She had seen what fame did to truth; it turned it into entertainment. So she stayed in the background, doing the work no one noticed, coordinating transparency reports, translating apology letters, helping rebuild bridges that others had burned for profit. One late evening, as she left the building, she found the assistant, now officially Takeda's chief of staff, waiting near the lobby doors. His name was Kenji Ito, though she still thought of him as the silent observer from that first night at Le Satori. "He wants to see you," Kenji said, at his home. Something in his tone, gentle but urgent, made her follow without hesitation. Takeda's penthouse looked different this time. The furniture was covered, the walls bare, the bonsai near the window pruned down to its roots. "You're leaving," Clara said quietly. He smiled, but the sadness in it was unmistakable. "They call it retirement," he said, but I call it exile with good manners. She wanted to protest, to tell him the world still needed his voice, but he raised a hand. The company must live beyond me. That is how you know it was built with purpose. He led her to the window where snow once fell, the river now dark and moving fast beneath the lights. When I began Takeda Holdings, he said, I believed respect was a gift you earned. I was wrong. It is a discipline you practice, even when no one returns it. He turned to her then, his expression filled with something like pride. You practiced it better than I ever did. From his desk, he retrieved a sealed envelope and placed it in her hands. Inside are 2 letters, he said. One for the board, naming you as Interim Director of Cultural Integrity. The other for you, a personal request. She hesitated, heart pounding, then opened the personal letter. It was handwritten in Japanese, the characters flowing like brushstrokes. Build bridges where I left ruins. Let kindness be your strategy. And when the world forgets my name, remind them that respect was never mine, it was yours. Tears blurred the words before she could finish reading. I can't take this, she whispered. You can, he said softly, because you already have. They stood in silence for a moment, the city's hum filling the space where gratitude couldn't find language. That night, after leaving the penthouse, Clara walked aimlessly through the streets, the envelope pressed to her chest beneath her coat. The air carried the scent of rain and cold metal, the sound of taxis merging with the heartbeat of the city. She passed Bryant Park, where the fountain had thawed, and paused at its edge, watching ripples spread across the water's surface. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe without armor. The following week, Takeda announced his official resignation, naming her to the position he had prepared. The boardroom erupted with disbelief, but none dared contest the decision. Her first day as interim director was quiet. There were no cameras, no congratulations, just the steady hum of work waiting to be done. She sat at his old desk, the silver pen resting where he had left it, and began drafting a letter to the Kyoto Foundation, restoring the donations Mina had once tried to protect. The act felt small compared to the storm that had brought her here, but small acts, she realized, were the true architecture of change. As dusk fell, she looked out across the city, its towers glowing like lanterns against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Takeda was beginning a quieter life, and somewhere else, perhaps, Mina was watching too, knowing that her defiance had not been in vain. Clara closed her eyes and let the moment settle the sound of the city, the faint hum of the office, the echo of everything that had led her here. When she finally stood to leave, she slipped the silver pen into her pocket. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint scent of winter's end. She thought of the restaurant where it had all begun, the clatter of plates, the sound of her own voice, speaking gentle Japanese to a stranger everyone else had ignored. It felt like another life, and yet it was still the same lesson written differently. Kindness, spoken fluently, could dismantle empires and rebuild them on something stronger. As she walked home under the streetlights, the city around her shimmered with quiet promise. Power, she realized, had never belonged to those who owned the tallest buildings or the loudest voices. It belonged to those who could stand in the cold and still choose respect. And so she did, one step at a time, carrying forward the only language that had ever truly changed anything, the simple, untranslatable grammar of human decency. Spring arrived slowly, as if the city itself had forgotten how to soften. The last of the winter ice melted into the gutters, revealing streets bruised with color and memory. Clara walked to work beneath a sky washed clean, her reflection passing across the shop windows like a quiet ghost of everything she had survived. It had been 3 months since Takeda's resignation and her unexpected rise, 3 months since the world had turned its gaze from scandal to silence. The news cycle had moved on, but within the company the echoes remained. Each day she felt them beneath her feet, the residue of fear, the fragile beginnings of renewal. As interim director, she had restructured the Cultural Integrity Program, transforming it from a symbolic department into something living and accountable. Instead of polished brochures and scripted statements, they funded art workshops, bilingual education centers, and small grants for cultural preservation in underrepresented communities. She traveled between cities New York, Kyoto, San Francisco, bridging teams that had once existed like islands. And everywhere she went, she carried Takeda's letter folded neatly in her notebook, its ink fading but its message unbroken. Build bridges where I left ruins. In public, she remained composed, her tone measured, her presence precise. But in private moments on flights, in quiet hotel rooms, she found herself haunted by questions no title could answer. What if she failed him? What if his faith in her had been misplaced? Power, she now knew, was not heavy in the hands, it was heavy in the conscience. Some nights she lay awake replaying the first moment of all this, the spilled glass, the words in Japanese, the bow that had changed everything, and wondered if destiny had a sense of irony. One morning, as she prepared for a quarterly presentation to the board, Kenji entered her office carrying a sealed envelope. "This came from Kyoto," he said, placing it gently on her desk. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her breath catching before she even opened it. The letter was from Takeda, written on thin cream paper in the same deliberate brushstrokes that had always carried the weight of thought. "Clara-san," it began, "I am writing from the garden Aiko once tended. The cherry blossoms have bloomed early this year, and I find myself thinking of the things that grow only after loss." She read the rest slowly, each line a quiet meditation on grace and endurance. "You were never meant to follow my path," he wrote. "You were meant to correct it. If my legacy is a lesson, let it be that truth, when spoken kindly, does not destroy, it heals." When she finished reading, she folded the letter and pressed it again. Honest symphony, imperfect, stubborn, but endlessly trying to understand one another. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her back to that first night at La Satori. The trembling of a teacup, the stillness that followed her words, the way kindness had felt like defiance. It wasn't the moment itself that had changed her, she understood now, but the echo of it, the realization that empathy, once spoken, kept moving through people long after it left your lips. She imagined it still moving through the city, invisible but alive, carried in gestures and choices and the quiet courage of ordinary lives. When she opened her eyes, twilight had begun to fall. The skyscrapers shimmered against the violet sky, their windows glowing like constellations scattered across the horizon. In the glass reflection of a nearby building, she saw herself no longer the timid waitress or the accidental heroine, but a woman shaped by both humility and will. Somewhere between those two forces, she had found her balance, and in that balance, a kind of peace. As she rose to leave, a soft wind swept through the park, scattering the petals from the nearby cherry trees Takeda had once donated. The petals swirled around her feet like a benediction, delicate and fleeting, yet full of meaning. She whispered quietly into the wind, the same words that had followed her across every chapter of this story. Respect speaks every language. The words drifted upward, lost among the city sounds, the honking cars, the distant music, the murmurs of strangers, but she knew they would land somewhere, maybe in another person's silence, maybe in another act of courage yet to come. As she walked home, the night unfolded gently around her, the world vast but kind, and she understood that her story was no longer about survival or redemption, it was about continuity, the endless translation between hearts that refused to stop listening. Under the city's golden haze, Clara disappeared into the rhythm of her own footsteps, carrying forward the quiet truth she had always known, but only now could name. Power fades, empires fall, but kindness once spoken aloud never truly ends.